Everyone, and welcome to activity 17. Today we are going to talk about sine and cosine and their graphs, as well as some basic transformations. Our sine graph can be equated back to when we think about our unit circle, and as we move around the unit circle, if we think about the four quadrants, we know that we have these basic values using the x and y coordinates, and sine is our y coordinates. So reminder with sine, we start at 1 comma 0, so 0 would be our sine value there, and then as we start moving around, as we go up to pi over 2, our y value is 1, and then we go to pi, we're at negative 1 comma 0, so we're back down to 0. Then at 3 pi over 2, we're down at 0 comma negative 1. So we would go back down then to negative 1. And then finally, as we get back to 2 pi, we are back to 0. So our basic graph of sine, again, will repeat by the time we get to 2 pi. So we see at each of these values, we're just using those y coordinates from the unit circle. And of course, being the periodic function that it is, if we extended this graph, it would keep repeating in the other direction as well, or we can continue on that pattern. But our basic one cycle through, we see there. Now, cosine, we are using our x values. So at 0, cosine starts at 1, then the x value goes down to 0 at pi over 2, then we go down to negative 1 at pi, back up to 0, back up to 1. So again, if you think about these as being kind of our coordinates around the unit circle, these are our values, so we would see this basic graph of cosine, again, based off of those x values around our unit circle. So as we start transforming, we've talked a lot about transformations throughout the course of the year. The parameters are doing kind of the same thing. Parameter A is going to be our vertical stretch / shrinks. We also then will be affected in the amplitude based on that. A negative A value will be a reflection over our midline. Speaking of midline, that's going to be the vertical shift when we're moving up and down. And then we also have our phase shift for the horizontal shifts, left and right. Remember, we call those phase shifts when we talk about trig, when we move them left or right. Now, we'll talk more about parameter B later on in the next lesson. So for now, each time, we want to sketch a basic transformed graph off of our parent functions. And again, we always want to think about the big thing with our sine graph being that it starts at the midline each time. And with our cosine graph, those are always going to start at the amplitude. So we have, not the amplitude, at the max, or officially a min if it is a reflected cosine graph. So for instance, on this first one, that reflected cosine graph, again, we are always going to repeat by the time we get to 2 pi, and each time these are going up by pi over 2 as our scale on the x-axis, and we could just say we're going up by 1s on the y-axis each time. Now in this case for our cosine graph, we normally would start at the maximum value. In this case, if our amplitude is 3, we'd be 3 units above our midline at y equals 0, so we'd start at 3. But because this is also being reflected, we're actually going to start down at negative 3, go back to our midline at 0, up to our max at 3, back down to 0, back down to our min. So we see this reflected cosine graph. And again, we can keep this pattern going if we want the other, each direction. However, we just need to see one full cycle each time in order to complete our graph. On the next one, we see a sine graph. This time, this sine graph is shifted up 3 units. So again, we have our basic scale each time that we are increasing by. We're going to finish our cycle by 2 pi. Sine starts at the midline, goes up 1 unit, the amplitude, back to the midline, down 1 unit, back to our midline, sketch our little shifted up sine graph. On the next page, we have a both shifted up and stretched out cosine graph. So this midline is going to shift up 1 unit. And again, normally with cosine, what's going to happen is we are going to see that our cosine graph starts at the maximum value. So this time, because our amplitude is 2 and our midline is at 1, we would have to take that value of the midline and add on 2. So really our starting point this time is going to be up here at 0, 3. Then we go back to the midline. Our minimum value then is going to be, 2 units below that midline, back to the midline, back 2 units above the midline. So there would be our cosine graph. Our next one has, again, a slightly shifted sine graph. This time we see that we have a reflection with that sine graph. So instead of our sine graph starting at the midline and going up, what's going to happen with our sine graph, it's going to still start at the midline, but it's going to go down, back to the midline, up, back to the midline. So we see that reflection over our midline, down on that. All right, next we have a shifted down cosine graph. This time our midline is shifted down 4 units. And we also are going to see on this graph that we have both a reflection and an amplitude change. So we're going to start at the minimum value this time, 2 units below that midline at -4, back to the midline, up, back to the midline, down. So we see again that reflected upside down shaped cosine graph. And then number 8 is going to show us our first phase shift. So notice we don't have a vertical shift up or down this time. Midline's just at y = 0. But we're going to see that our graph is actually going to start to the right, pi/2. So what's going to happen here is instead of starting at 0, 0, we're going to start at pi/2, 0, go up the 2 units to the max point, back to the midline, down, and then we're going to have to extend our graph out to see 1 full cycle to the right, since we shifted that graph to the right. Or you could have kept the pattern going to the left, obviously. Could have also worked to show at least 1 full cycle. The next one also has a phase shift. Again, no vertical shift, so midline at y = 0. This time, though, we are starting our graph to the right pi units. So remember, each of these are going up by pi/2. So in this case, we're going to start our graph to the right. And then because it's cosine, we have to start at the max or the min. This time, the min, since we had that reflection happening. So we're going to start down 2 units from the midline, back to the midline, up, back to the midline, down. So we see that full revolution. Or again, you could have went and started the pattern to the left as well there. As long as you show 1 full revolution, doesn't matter if you continued it to the right or the left. All right, our last example has a lot going on. It starts with that horizontal shift down, so our midline's through y = -2. And then this time we're actually shifting our graph to the left, pi/2. So normally we see going to the right here, 2 pi. This time we're going to start, though, our graph shifted to the left at -pi/2. And our sine graph will start on that midline. This time we are going down 3 units from the midline. So we're at 0, -5, actually. Back to the midline, up 3 units from the midline, back to the midline to see that full revolution. And again, you could always continue in either direction if you pleased. All right, thanks everyone for watching. We will deal more with these in class.